So my topic for today is complications in pediatric anesthesia. So today we'll be dealing with two common conditions in pediatric anesthesia, which is recent URTI and second is laryngospasm. So these two conditions are very common in pediatric anesthesia, and we come across these conditions very commonly in this kind in children. We'll be dealing it in a case-wise manner. So our first child is a 2-year-old male patient posted for circumcision. He has mild cough cold since 2 days. There is no history of fever, and he has a clear chest. So how do we go about dealing with this child? Whether we need to operate him, whether we need to postpone him. So it all depends on one major factor, which is whether you are a skilled pediatric anesthesiologist or an occasional pediatric anesthesiologist. If you are a skilled pediatric anesthesiologist, then with due precautions, you can easily go ahead with this surgery. If you are an occasional pediatric anesthesiologist and the case that we have, then I would suggest that you have at least one more anesthetist with you so that you will be able to manage if at all any complications happen. So what are we worried about when we are dealing with URTI? URTI is one of the most frequent illness in children. They have around 6 to 8 episodes of URTIs per year. And what we are worried about is a potential risk of perioperative respiratory adverse events. Now, these perioperative respiratory adverse events can be events like laryngospasm and bronchospasm, which can be life-threatening events. They can be minor events like coughing, or they can cause things like atelectasis, hypoxia, and very severe laryngospasms, when not managed properly, can lead to negative pressure pulmonary edema. The perioperative respiratory adverse events also leads to prolonged hospitalization. They lead to increased readmission rates, and the long-term consequences of brief desaturation are really unknown. So the entire gist of the lecture, it depends on this score, which is the COLD score. Now, COLD score is an acronym for current signs and symptoms, onset, lung disease, airway device, and surgery. So it is an Apgar-like scoring system in which you give points to each score. The points given are 1, 2, and 5. So basically, higher the score, higher is the risk of perioperative respiratory adverse events developing in these children. So the current signs and symptoms can be none, or they can be minor, like URTI without any expectoration, a simple sore throat, sneezing. These are, I will give them a score of 2. A 5 score will be given to children with moderate to severe symptoms, like those with purulent expectorations, with wet cough, or they have a toxic appearance to them. Now the onset, this is very important. If it is less than 2 weeks, an acute URTI, then the chances of respiratory adverse events are highest. So they receive a score of 5. 2 to 4 weeks is 2, and greater than 4 weeks, the chances of developing is lesser. So it will give a score of 1. So if it is an elective surgery, then it is best to wait for around 4 weeks before you give them anesthesia. So something like circumcision can wait for 4 weeks, and then after 4 weeks, if he has no symptoms, we can give him anesthesia. Now, something like lung disease. Lung disease can be none, and no lung disease is given a score of 1. A mild lung disease is given a score of 2, and a score of 5 is given to moderate to severe lung disease. A chronic lung disease in an infant will receive a score of around 5. Now, airway device can be none or face mask, which receives a score of 1. So in this scenario, the least airway intervention you do, or the way we do cases, is on a face mask with some kind of block. They have the least chances of perioperative respiratory events like laryngospasms developing. But if you are not someone who is used to managing children, then it is best to tube the child. But with the tube, during extubation, the chances of respiratory adverse events are still very high. So you should have that in mind. Now it also depends on the surgery. So airway surgeries like palate, rigid bronchoscopy, something like tonsillectomies, they receive the highest score, which is 5. Something that does not involve the airway will receive a score of 1. So the higher the score, higher is the chances of respiratory events developing in this kind of children. So now COLD score has no score which is 0. So respiratory adverse events can happen even with a basic score of 5. So there is nothing like a 0 scoring system. So you have to be careful in all children. Certain risk factors and risk reduction strategies are not developed. are not covered in this, like whether you are a pediatric anesthesiologist or a non-pediatric anesthesiologist. A pediatric anesthesiologist, the chances of developing respiratory events are lesser because he's much used to managing this kind of children, and he knows what planes to manage or keep the child in when you are dealing with such kind of children. Now, deep versus awake extubation is something which is highly debated or highly sort of discussed in pediatric circles. So it is actually your choice. Deep extubations help in reducing the chances of complications, but you should be used to doing deep extubations and managing any kind of airway events if at all they happen. Awake extubation is the best according to me. Awake extubation should be done in all kinds of these cases. So there is pre-operative evaluation. What do you ask? The single most important question that you ask to the mother is your child sick? If the mother says that the child appears sick, toxic, then there is no way you are going ahead with this surgery. You straight away postpone this case. If there are mild symptoms, you can go ahead with due precautions. You can do this surgery. If it is something with very severe symptoms, then of course you postpone for at least 4 weeks if the surgery can wait. If it is an elective procedure, if it is an emergency, then with due risk you have to go ahead. Moderate symptoms is something where you have to individualize. So if the child has moderate symptoms and you are a pediatric anesthesiologist, then you can do this case with minimal airway interventions and use of regional blocks is how I would suggest. So if you are not a pediatric anesthesiologist, then you individualize, or maybe you have some help ready when you are dealing with some this kind of children. So coming to pre-operative optimization, it is always a good idea to optimize these children prior to surgery. So optimization can be done with short-acting beta-2 agonists like salbutamol or levosalbutamol. They work very well and they are proven to reduce the chances of respiratory events like bronchospasms. Anti-sialogogues are something like glycopyrrolate, which we don't use normally in all cases nowadays, but these children are more prone to secretion. So in these children, a dose of glycopyrrolate is very, very useful. Nasal decongestants, glucocorticoids are of doubtful significance. None of the studies have shown that they are useful, but something like a patient with asthma may benefit with steroids like dexamethasone. And chest physiotherapy prior or even towards the end of the surgery does help in optimization of this children. Now, anesthesia management will include a good pre-medication. The child should not come in crying. If it comes in, the child comes in crying, the chances of spasms are higher. Airway management should be decided according to the case. So something like this case, circumcision, I would go ahead with the least possible airway interventions. Face mask is better than laryngeal mask airway, and the worst is tracheal intubations. Induction and maintenance of anesthesia is very, very important. During induction, if you are doing inductions without IV lines, then your induction should be proper and they should be IV lines should be taken in extremely deep planes of anesthesia. Regional blocks help in reducing complications and they should be given wherever they are possible. And treatment of complications should be done at the earliest before major complications happen. Post-operative care would include something like steroids, nebulization. They are always good. Extubation in prone positions are good. There is something called as a no-touch technique. So essentially in no-touch technique, what you are doing is in deep planes of anesthesia, you do the suctioning, and in deep plane only you make the child lateral. You wait for the child to become completely awake, and only when he has eye opening, that is the time you extubate without any suctioning. So that is called as no-touch technique. So the idea is that you don't touch the child in light planes of anesthesia, which is when the chances of spasms is maximum. So this is about URTI. So in short, milder symptoms, you can go ahead with elective surgery. Moderate symptoms, you have to individualize and you should be capable of managing those complications and even preventing them. So a pediatric anesthesiologist can go ahead with a child with moderate symptoms. But if he has severe symptoms, then for an elective surgery, it is best to wait for 4 weeks before you give this case. So coming to our second scenario, now the same patient is posted for circumcision. He is on a face mask with a penile block, which is the common thing that's being used. Now, as soon as the surgery, you have given a penile block, surgeon applies the clamps for circumcision. As soon as clamps are applied, the saturation starts falling and you are unable to ventilate the child. So now you are dealing with something called as a laryngospasm, which is very, very common condition in pediatric age group. They say the incidence is as high as 10 to 25%. But I would say that in the hands of a pediatric anesthesiologist, the incidence definitely comes down. It is not as high as 10%. So laryngospasm is basically a sustained closure of the vocal cords. It is a sustained closure of both true and false vocal cords along with the supraglottic tissues. The supraglottic tissues sort of converge on the larynx, and that is what causes laryngospasm. It can be a partial or a complete loss of airway. So as far as laryngospasm is concerned, it is actually a primitive protective reflex to prevent aspiration. So you get laryngospasms even while you are awake. So say you are vomiting. When you are vomiting, the vomiters that is coming out, it sort of triggers a laryngospasm. But in this state, you are awake. So when you are awake, they say that there is some higher control or higher centers control the laryngospasm. So these higher centers can bring about an end to the adduction of the vocal cords, and there is sort of some higher control, higher center control to it. So in awake state, this is not much of an issue, but our problem is the child is anesthetized. So when you are anesthetized, this higher control is lost. So that is what we are worried about, and hence we need to treat the laryngospasm when the child is under anesthesia. The corollary to this is the treatment of laryngospasm is also making the child awake. So if you have an awake child, then you don't have a laryngospasm. So, or the laryngospasm can be controlled. So, and when you have a laryngospasm, your ideal thing to have is an awake patient. So as soon as the ultimate treatment is an awake child. So what is laryngospasm? It is a laryngeal or visceral stimulation in light plane of anesthesia. Remember, light plane of anesthesia is the biggest enemy in pediatric anesthesia. Any stimulation, laryngeal or any visceral stimulation, like we have in this case of circumcision, can lead to a laryngospasm. Laryngospasm can be easily prevented. So if you have a child with URTI, then it is important, like the surgeon is applying clamps. So even if your block has not acted, make sure that the child is adequately deep before he applies the clamp. So it can be prevented by keeping a deep plane of anesthesia, because laryngospasm only happens in light planes of anesthesia. And prompt recognition and early correction is very, very essential. Otherwise, the child tends to go in severe complications like bradycardia, desaturations, and they can also go in negative pressure pulmonary edema, which is a life-threatening complication. Now, what is laryngospasm is? Laryngosperm is a sustained closure of true and false vocal cords. As you can see in the upper picture, the lower picture shows the cords open. The upper picture shows the cords closed. So when the cords are closed, you are unable to ventilate, and at the same time, the child is forcefully breathing against these against these vocal cords. So that can trigger a negative pressure pulmonary edema if this is not opened immediately. So how does this happen? This happens via the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve sort of is both the afferent and the efferent. It leads to, it takes the message to the higher centers, which leads to adduction of the true and false vocal cords, which leads to your laryngospasm. Now, treatment of laryngospasm is, before we come to treatment, we have to realize that CPAP is continuous positive airway pressure. CPAP is a very, very important and the first line of treatment for laryngospasm. What it does is, it helps in pulling down the supraglottic soft tissues, the soft tissues which are pulled down because of the laryngospasm. It helps in relieving that pulling down. So CPAP is the first treatment that you will give in a case of laryngospasm. So when you have a child with laryngospasm, what you should do is, initially is you should check whether the oropharynx is clear. Sometimes the trigger for laryngospasm is something like an aspiration or blood within the, or some mucus within the oral cavity. So you should clear that. Second is 100% O2. You start applying CPAP with your JR circuit or your closed circuit, whatever you are comfortable. Second line of treatment is, of course, deepening the plane of anesthesia. If your CPAP is not working, then deepening the plane of anesthesia with propofol. This will be helpful in around 75 to 80% of the cases. If this doesn't work, or if the spasm is very severe right from the beginning, then you give scoline in a dose of around 0.1 to 2 milligram per kg. Even a small dose of 0.1 milligram per kg is sufficient to relieve the spasm. Now, if you don't have an IV line, then there are a gamut of other things that you can do, which I'll be covering in the subsequent part of the lecture. A simplest thing that you can do is choline IM, but trust me, a CPAP should work much better than IM choline. If you are reaching the stage of IM choline, that means you have not managed the laryngospasm well. You can manage laryngospasms with a lot of other conditions. So two things to remember here: the role of hypoxia and hypercapnia with laryngospasms. So remember that laryngospasm will break under severe hypoxia. So there is no need to panic. Even if the patient is having bradycardia and desaturation, what will ultimately happen is his PaO2 will fall to below 50 millimeter of mercury, and this itself will relieve the adduction of the vocal cords, and the laryngospasm will treat itself. I'm not saying that you should wait for this to happen. You should have instituted other things before this stage is reached. But even if this happens, you should not panic. You should, the laryngospasm will treat itself. Ultimately nothing will happen, and when you give one puff of 100% O2, and all the bradycardia, desaturation, everything is cured, and the child will be fine. So what are the risk factors? The risk factors, most important is light plane of anesthesia. It is the most important risk factor for laryngospasm. Volatile anesthetics like sevoflurane and halothane are best for inductions. If you use any other agent for induction or maintenance like isoflurane or desflurane, they can cause, they increase the incidence of laryngospasms. As we discussed, mucus, blood, any secretions, any aspiration within the oral cavity is a trigger for laryngospasm. Airway device, like we discussed in URTI, the least the airway intervention, lesser is the least is the risk of laryngospasm. So no airway or just a face mask is better than a laryngeal mask airway or an oral airway, and the tracheal tube is the worst. Now, experience of anesthetist is very, very important. A pediatric anesthetist will know when to keep a deep plane of anesthesia. So a pediatric anesthesiologist will have far lesser incidence of laryngospasm than a non-pediatric anesthesiologist. Now, other patient factors like asthma, URTI, they of course increase the chances of laryngospasm. A tobacco chewer or someone with a history of gastroesophageal reflux will have a higher incidence of laryngospasm. Those with obstructive sleep apneas, obese children, or those with airway anomalies have a higher risk of laryngospasm. And laryngospasms is highest in airway surgeries like cleft palate, tonsillectomies. These surgeries have a much higher incidence of laryngospasms than non-airway surgeries. So remember, awake and deep planes are the best friends of pediatric anesthesiologists. Light plane is your enemy. That is where laryngospasms happen. And sedation is something which we follow commonly with face mask and blocks. So once your block starts acting, what you need to keep the child in is a sort of a state of sedation. That is just 0.6% sevoflurane, or if you're using propofol, just sedative doses of propofol. So in these planes, laryngospasms don't happen. So our goal during induction and maintenance is deep plane of anesthesia, and end of the surgery is awake patient. So remember, if you have a laryngospasm at the beginning of the surgery is yet to be done. So you need to keep the patient in deep planes of anesthesia throughout the surgery till the surgical stimulus is gone, or till your blocks start acting. So deep planes are our friend. And towards the end of surgery, if you have a laryngospasm, then our ultimate goal is an awake patient, because once you have an awake patient, as we discussed, the higher centers will take over and there will be no laryngospasm after that. So an awake patient is the ultimate goal that we have, and accordingly we should be able to treat laryngospasm. So first of all, it is very important to prevent laryngospasms, and trust me, all laryngospasms can be prevented. So you have to recognize the high risk patients like those with URTI, those with airway surgeries. Those are at the highest risk of laryngospasms. You have to maintain adequate depth at all critical stages. Like in this patient, when the surgeon is applying clamps, you have to maintain deep planes of anesthesia. So even if your block has not acted, the deep plane of anesthesia will prevent the laryngospasm. Induction and emergence is very critical because that is when the maximum laryngospasms happen. Deep and awake planes are the best, never in between. And no touch technique, as we discussed, is a very important tool to prevent laryngospasm. So pharmacologic prevention, two drugs are helpful in laryngospasms. Not much literature, but they say magnesium sulfate in a dose of around 15 milligram per kg may help in preventing laryngospasms, or lignocaine either IV in a dose of around 1.5 to 2 milligram per kg of the lignocaine without preservative, Xylocard 1, or a topical lignocaine spray can be helpful in preventing laryngospasm. But these are all doubtful and sort of anecdotal studies. They have no proven role in preventing laryngospasm. So this is how we do an induction. This is a 6-month-old child posted for circumcision. We are doing a an incremental sevoflurane induction. So where we have a constant flow around 2 to 3 liters per minute of air, oxygen or oxygen nitrous oxide, and sevoflurane is started at around 2 to 3%, and every 4 to 5 breaths you increase the sevoflurane by either 0.5 to 1%. So what I want you to observe is this breathing pattern. So even if you don't have any monitors, what you should do is you should just observe the breathing pattern. Now in this case, we have this child pre-medicated, and we don't have any IV line. So our goal is to put an IV line after a successful induction. So if you put an IV line in a light plane of anesthesia, what you will be left with is an laryngospasm with a without an IV line, which is the worst scenario you can have, because you cannot give any propofol or scoline to treat the laryngospasm. So this can be easily prevented by taking the IV line only in deep planes of anesthesia. To know that the plane is deep, you should know how to induce the child. So as you can see, initially the breathing was disorderly or it was very irregular, but now as you see, as the plane is increasing, as the mac is increasing, his respiration is becoming more and more regular, and like it was when he was in the awake state. Now this is when you start taking an IV line. Now you can see the breathing is proper. He is breathing at a normal tidal volume. His breaths have become shallow like what it is pre-induction, and this is when you start taking an IV line. If you take an IV line before this, then you will be landing up with a laryngospasm without any IV line, which is sort of a catastrophic kind of thing. You can manage it, definitely you can manage it without an IV line, but this is not something which you will like to be in. So if you are not comfortable with these techniques, best is to take IV line awake and then do an induction. And IV induction is far better than inhalational induction. The incidence of laryngospasm with propofol induction is lesser than sevoflurane induction. So if you are not used to, just take an IV line awake or with some pre-medication with midas and ketamine, or only midas or dexmedetomidine, and then you induce the child with IV or inhalational induction. So once you have recognized that the child has laryngospasm, how do you treat it? So the first thing you do is call for help. This is the first thing you do. Second thing you do obviously is 100% O2 with CPAP. You look for whether there is any stimulus, any secretions, any blood within the larynx. If it is there, then you clear it. And you have to relieve the supraglottic obstruction with CPAP with 100% O2, as we discussed in the earlier part of the lecture. Now you have to remember that you should have separate plans during induction and emergence. So if you have a laryngospasm during induction, you have the entire surgery remaining. So what you would do is you would like to maintain the child in a deep plane of anesthesia, so that if you have a laryngospasm during induction, I would say propofol is better than scoline. So if you are able to treat with propofol, just give boluses of 0.5 to incremental boluses of 0.5 to 1 to 2 milligram per kg of propofol IV, and then most of the cases you will be successfully able to manage the laryngospasm. But once you have a laryngospasm, throughout the surgery, make sure that deep planes are maintained throughout the procedure. There should be no light planes throughout the procedure after a laryngospasm. If it happens during emergence and you have not used any reversal agents, then scoline is the best drug, because ultimately what you want is an awake child. So if you give propofol, that will be delaying the awakening of the child. So scoline is far better. But if you have given some reversal, like say if you have if you have intubated and you extubated the child after reversal, then giving scoline after reversal, after neostigmine, can make the child prone to go into a phase 2 block kind of thing. So that is when you will avoid scoline. You will rather give propofol in these kind of scenarios. Now, suppose if you don't have an IV line, or if it happens during the induction, then one option is giving IM scoline. You can give IM scoline in the buttocks, which is the dose is around 4 to 5 milligram per kg. But most of the times you don't reach this stage. You just keep on giving 100% O2 with CPAP, and most of the times your spasm will be relieved. But if you don't have, it is good to remember, if you can't find an IV line, or if you are in a scenario where you have a help, like say you have a pediatric surgeon in the OT who is able to take IV lines, but he's not able to find, and if he's able to find an IV line, then it is best that he keeps searching for an IV line. He takes an IV line and he give IV scoline. But if he's not able to find, then intraosseous access should be considered. Intraosseous access and giving IV scoline is better than giving IM scoline. If you don't have all that, then intralingual scoline or giving scoline within the muscle of the tongue is what is recommended. It is around 2 to 3 milligram per kg. This is better than giving intramuscular, because in a child with laryngospasm, what happens eventually is a bradycardia. So the circulation is disturbed. So areas with a higher circulation like the tongue will have a better chance of the scoline reaching the CNS and giving the desired effect. So giving intralingual scoline is better than giving IM scoline. But what it also means is you have to remove the mask from the patient, which means that you have to remove the CPAP. So it is never a good idea, and you should never reach this stage. Better is to take IV and give IV scoline, or just continue to give 100% O2 with CPAP, and it is good enough for most of the cases. So this is the chart which I follow. This is my chart. So whenever you have a laryngospasm, you start with 100% O2 with CPAP. You obviously call for help. There's something called as a Larson's maneuver, which we'll be dealing in the next slide. So that is something you should start giving. Now, if it happens during induction, if you're doing an inhalational induction without any IV line, then what you should do is give CPAP 100% O2. You call for help. You give Larson's maneuver, and you just do not leave the airway. Just don't be worried. Just don't leave the airway. The worst thing that can happen in this scenario is a bradycardia and desaturation. But as we discussed earlier, it will eventually, the laryngospasm will be treated with the onset of hypoxia and one good breath of 100% O2, and you will have the child back. So you should not worry about, or you should not panic when you have a laryngospasm. Or if you have a surgeon or some sister who is capable of taking an IV line, or you have a help, an anesthetist who is able to take an IV line, then it is best to take an IV line, and you give propofol and or scoline. Scoline is a better drug to give. 0.1 milligram per kg. Such a low dose is capable of relieving the laryngospasm. Now, if laryngospasm happens during the end of the surgery and you have given reversal, then it is better to give propofol. I would prefer to give scoline if reversal is not given in most of the cases, because scoline will not delay the awakening, and the ultimate goal or the ultimate treatment of laryngospasm is an awake patient, as we discussed, because higher centers have the capacity to treat the laryngospasm in an awake child. Now, there are certain anecdotal options, like we said, Larson's notch, the pressure on the Larson's notch. Now, how do you give pressure? You give it over the styloid process behind the ramus of the mandible, and it has to be given bilaterally. It cannot be given unilaterally. It is like your jaw thrust. A deep jaw thrust is what Larson's maneuver is. It helps in relieving spasms in around 30 to 40% cases. Better than this Larson's maneuver is chest compression. So like you give CPR, not as vigorous as CPR, but gentle chest compressions will be able to treat laryngospasms. The mechanisms described is increased intrathoracic pressure will help in relieving the spasm from below. Or another mechanism is it stimulates breathing, so that also relieves the spasm. And the third mechanism proposed by them is sort of Herring-Breuer reflex is stimulated, which treats your laryngospasm, or it relieves the vagal nerve stimulation. Now, superior laryngeal nerve blocks is something which we never practice, but they say that superior laryngeal nerve blocks prevents and treats laryngospasms. Drugs like NTG or doxapram can be used, but we have hardly ever used them. And but they say that they are useful in preventing laryngospasms. So that's it for laryngospasms. Hopefully, we'll discuss the complications, the remaining complications in the subsequent lectures. Thank you.